Chapter 10.
Did you find what you are looking for?
Volonic asked, as we climbed back up the stairs. Yes, Volonic, I said with a sigh. I was looking for absolutely nothing, and that's what we found, so I'm super pleased.
Ah, I see. So you were hoping something you did not wish to see would not be there, and now your wishes have been answered. That is excellent.
No, it's not excellent, I growled. There was nothing there, and nothing is exactly what we have now. Whatever we have on that escape pod is all we have to live on until it runs out, and then we die. Volonic was quiet for a moment.
I have been thinking, Zeke. As I was the one who thought to launch the escape pod, does it not seem more logical that I should have more of the supplies? After all, your being here is a mere accident. It seems unfair that my chances of survival should be endangered when you have no wish to be here in the first place.
Keep in mind, I was standing behind him and holding a pistol while he said this. I suppose I might have been angrier, but I'd grown used to Volonic being clueless, and his idiocy was really the least of my problems. I would need to go back through the supplies on the pod, as well as do a more thorough scan of local plants and animal life. I now believed that finding a source of water would not be too difficult, and there was a purification unit on the escape pod, but food would be an issue, and I didn't want to wait until we were starving to find a new source of things to eat. What would I be surviving for, though? I supposed it would be the eventual hope of rescue, but if my friends weren't able to come back here before the supplies ran out, I wasn't sure they would ever be coming back. The best I might hope for would be to live out my days with Volonic as my only companion. The more I thought about it, the more miserable I became. Still, I couldn't give up. I wouldn't let myself. There had to be a way. I was on a planet. An entire planet, and if Captain Quassel was right, then the Formers had lived here. That meant there had to be more archaeological sites somewhere, and I knew that the Formers always kept hidden ships on their planets. That's what Smelly had told me. That's when it hit me. Smelly! I still had the little metal disc that would let me signal my completely unreliable AI buddy. I could call Smelly, and it would be here in an instant through some kind of ancient technological wizardry. The way I understood it, when I activated the device, the quantum entanglement with its counterpart would not only relay the symbol, but do so in what to me would seem to be the past, so that Smelly would receive my request in time to show up pretty much the moment I pressed the button. There were a couple of reasons to hold off on using the signal, though. First of all, Smelly could be kind of a jerk. And while it owed me a favor, it had warned me not to use the device unless my life was in genuine danger. If I called it asking for rescue, it might say I'd bothered it needlessly and leave me here. Or leave me here until I was in real danger of starvation. If I waited until the food ran out, it might show up with supplies but refuse to transport me. Smelly wasn't evil, but it enjoyed messing with people, and the idea of trapping me forever with Volonic might prove too funny for Smelly to resist. Finally, I didn't want to call it unless I had no other choice, because an ancient former AI is a powerful ally, and until recently I'd actually been at the center of a major galactic conflict. If something went wrong and I needed a get-out-of-jail-free card to help bring down Junip or save my friends' lives, I wanted to have Smelly in my back pocket, so to speak. I needed to take some time to think about this, and time was one of the few things that I had. We came up the stairs with Volonic lurking behind me. The desert heat had begun to warm the chamber, and the bright light streamed through the cavern's entrance. Volonic suddenly put a hand on my shoulder. In general, I didn't like him to touch me, or speak, or look in my direction, but the expression on his face was fairly serious. His ears kept pivoting towards the entrance.
There are voices ahead.
Rarls have superior hearing, so the fact that I didn't hear anything meant nothing. I held up a hand, indicating that Volonic should stay put, with the implied additional meaning that he should not do anything stupid. I crept forward, keeping my back to the wall, deep in the shadows. Anyone peering into the cavern would see nothing but darkness, but I could see out. Approaching the entrance to the cavern, still about 100 feet away, were 3 fads. They appeared a little odd to me, and it took me a moment to figure out why that was. They were the only fads I'd ever seen in anything other than military uniforms. All 3 wore what I could only imagine to be fadic casual wear. Button-down, long-sleeve shirts tucked into loose pants, held up by suspenders, and over that, ankle-length coats with high collars. Their clothes were all muted colors, what people back on my home planet called earth tones, as if they wanted to blend in with the desert. Most surprisingly, they wore gigantic, wide-brimmed hats that were almost like cowboy hats. These looked ridiculous, perched on top of their big, rectangular heads, but I'd never seen a fad who hadn't filled me with horror. Their corpse-gray skin and jutting tusks made them look fierce, but it was their cruelty, their drive to conquer and dominate, that made them terrifying. I also disliked the fact that every single member of their species seemed dedicated to dumping as much misery on me as possible. I stayed in the shadows, watching them, making sure it was only those 3, and waiting until they were turned away so that I had the best chance of retreating without anything catching their eye. I knew I wouldn't have been able to see into the cavern's mouth, but I had no idea what fadic vision was like, or how these particular fads might have been augmented. Having 3 fads coming towards you is almost always a bad thing. Almost, but not in this case. Well, the fact that they would probably want to kill or capture me on sight was bad, but less bad was that they were here on the planet. That meant supplies. Shelter. At least 1 ship. In other words, I now had at least a hope of getting off this world and finding my friends. I crept back towards Volonic, who was leaning against the wall, looking less concerned than bored, like I was keeping him from something he'd much rather be doing. "There are fads out there," I said in a hushed voice. 3 of them. We need to wait until they go away, but if it looks like they might be entering the cave, we'll head deeper inside. I was going to have to figure out where they were camped, but I would do that later, preferably without Volonic leaning over my shoulder. Right now, I had to make sure that we weren't captured or killed. Volonic put down his pack and began to rummage through it.
"I may have brought something that can help us, should they decide to come in here," he whispered.
"Like what?" I demanded, unable to hide my frustration. He hadn't brought food or water. I seriously doubted he had brought anything of use. "Did you happen to bring a stun grenade?" He pulled his furry hand out of the bag and held up a metal sphere about the size of a baseball. It was a phatic stun grenade. Had he activated the grenade and, actually stunned me, I could not have been more stunned. That is admittedly an exaggeration, since if he'd done that I would have been unconscious, but the metaphor was sound. Volonic had brought something useful, and my brain was having trouble dealing with this turn of events. "I thought you said you didn't bring any weapons," I hissed.
"No, you said that," he answered. "I said I didn't bring a pistol. I didn't bother to correct you because you get very irritable when someone says you are wrong."
I grabbed the grenade out of his hand before he could do something more Volonic-like and activate it or toss it into the dark for no reason or retract his jaw and swallow it whole. I put nothing past him, and I knew this moment of competence would be brief and unstable. "Why did you bring a stun grenade?" I demanded. "We're on a deserted planet. What possible use could a stun grenade be?"
"Obviously, the planet is not deserted," Volonic said, "and the use would be to incapacitate those fads. Clearly, this is another example of how you must always be right about everything."
I swallowed a couple dozen response. Volonic had brought something that should have been entirely useless, but it turned out to be something that could save our lives. My mother had a saying, "Even a stopped clock is right twice a day." I decided that was as good an explanation as I was going to get. I crept back along the wall, keeping in shadow, and watched the fads. They had completed some kind of survey of the dig area, and were now in the process of pointing at our footprints and discussing them. They were too far away, and the wind was blowing into the cave, creating a whistling noise, so I couldn't make out any of their words. Pointing towards the cavern was explanation enough, though. They were coming inside. Ideally, I would not have to use the grenade. I'd rather retreat back to the escape pod without their knowing we were in here. But if they were going to enter the cavern, I didn't see that we had much of a choice. I'd rather they knew someone was here than for them to know our species and our number. Most of all, I could not let them know who I was. There was no way I was going to let myself be captured. I'd rather die of hunger and thirst in the desert than let them parade me all over their news outputs. The 3 fads were about 20 feet away from the entrance when I armed and tossed the grenade. They stared at it as it landed by their feet, kicked up a little cloud of dust. Then it detonated. With a flash and a rumbling blast that rattled my bones, even though I was outside the area of effect. The fads fell over, unconscious, like someone had hit their off switch, and that was good enough for me. "Assume there are more out there," I said to Volonic. "So keep low and keep quiet. We need to get back to the pod, but we have to scout it before approaching in case they've discovered it already. You have to follow my lead and do everything I tell you."
"Of course,"
Volonic said.
"Don't I always?"
I moved over to the fads and searched them quickly for weapons. Surprisingly, they had none. No food either, just some old-fashioned canteens with water in them. I hated fads, but I wasn't going to abandon them in the desert with nothing to drink. So I left the canteens and hoped I didn't later regret the decision. When I'd given up on finding anything useful, we headed towards the uphill slope we would need to climb in order to get back to the pod. To anyone watching from a distance, we would be visible and slow. But there was only one way back, and we had to take it. At least it was starting to get dark, so it was cooler. It would probably be cold soon, and that would be its own challenge, but I had enough problems to face now without worrying about the problems that were going to crop up. The climbing was difficult, and though Volonic kept quiet, I could hear the complaints vibrating off him, even though his species was more athletic than mine. Still, he didn't give them voice, and that showed some improvement on his part. We reached the top of the climb and kept our backs to the outcropping as we risked scanning the expanse ahead, but there was no sign of any fad or their vehicles. It took twice as long to get back as it had to get to the dig in the first place. Night had almost completely fallen by the time we were in visual range of the pod. In spite of Vilonic's implicit protest, we crouched low and watched the pod for another hour, until the desert had descended into full darkness. The temperature moved from refreshingly cool to uncomfortably cold, and I regretted having left my blazer behind. I heard the sounds of nocturnal creatures beginning to crawl and skitter and belch frog-like cries. These last, I think, came from carnivorous plants. I realized that there might well be things far more dangerous than fads out there, and that it would be a terrible irony if I were to be taken down by an alien vine bite. But I couldn't protect myself against every unknown. Finally, I decided it was as safe as it would ever be, and we made it back to the pod. I closed the door, put on my blazer, and ate a food packet, then turned to the main control panel. It had to be possible to look for the heat signature of something like another ship. An escape pod would be designed to seek out friends and avoid foes. I wrestled with the main computer for a few minutes until I found exactly what I was looking for, but in order to run the kind of search I had in mind, the pod had to be in the air. I was tired, maybe too tired for safe flying, but I didn't think it was safe to wait. Unfortunately, it looked like I was going to have to. Power reserves, the computer told me, were too low for flight. That was bad news. The mostly good news was that the pod would recharge using solar energy. I hadn't realized this, and so I hadn't set the pod to recharge. I could do that in the morning, and if I was reading the data correctly, we'd have enough power to be airborne by noon. I hoped it would be enough time to avoid detection. I would sleep for a few hours, I decided, get up early and start the charging process, and lift off as soon as we could. There was a plan now. It was a vague plan at best that involved stealing a ship of unknown size from a phatic force of unknown number, so it was hard to say just how hopeless this plan might be. But I didn't care. I'd thought I'd run out of options before, but It turned out I wasn't done yet. I had a chance, and that was more than I'd had when we searched the former cave. I opened one of the emergency medical bays to use as a bed, and slipped inside. I closed my eyes and began running through the morning's tasks, but I couldn't concentrate. My brain was fried. Things began to run together. Somewhere in the distance, Volonic was talking, but his words were too distant to hear. I could, I thought dreamily, escape from him in sleep. I awoke with a start, but somehow managed to not sit up fast and hit my head. I checked my bracelet. It was now well past dawn. I'd overslept. I was annoyed with myself for having missed at least an hour of solar recharge. And I also had to pee. And while there was sort of an emergency onboard toilet, I was not about to go in front of Volonic. I pressed the button to open the door, and morning sunlight streamed into the pod. Standing outside the pod, as though they were about to knock, were 3 fads, the ones we'd stunned the day before.